In 1885, if you happened to pick up a copy of the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which was, a major newspaper of the era, you might have stumbled across an editorial that posed this seemingly straightforward question to its readers.
Right.
And the title of the piece was literally, "What are girls good for?"
Oh, man. It's the kind of headline that just immediately signals the whole cultural landscape of the time.
Absolutely.
Like, you can almost anticipate the exact specific flavor of condescension that's going to follow it.
Yeah. And it completely delivered on that front, too. I actually want to look at the exact framing the writer used, because it wasn't just like a casual dismissal.
No, it was very pointed.
Right. The writer explained, at great length and with just absolute certainty, that a woman's singular, biologically determined purpose was keeping house and raising children.
Right.
Careers, opinions, ambitions, participating in any public sphere at all, those were exclusively the domain of men.
Completely.
The piece actually argued that a girl who wanted anything more than that quiet domestic life was a monstrosity. I know. It explicitly framed female ambition as unnatural.
Which, to be fair, was the prevailing scientific and social consensus of the 1880s.
Right.
It wasn't just an angry columnist venting. This was a rigidly enforced boundary line drawn around half the entire population, and it was backed by the legal, medical, and religious institutions of the day.
Yeah, and usually people read that kind of thing, maybe grumbled to their friends about it, and just went about their day.
Right, because what else could you do?
Exactly. But our sources for today's deep dive focus on a 20-year-old reader named Elizabeth Cochran who saw that editorial and fundamentally rejected the premise.
She really did.
She fired off this anonymous, blistering rebuttal to the paper. So, the mission for our deep dive today is unpacking a stack of historical materials, articles, biographies, her own investigative texts, all about this young woman.
And it's such a rich pile of sources.
It really is. We're looking at someone who took that initial insult and answered it with a life of just absolute defiance.
And we really need to look closely at the mechanics of her trajectory, because she didn't just write a letter. She eventually took the pen name Nellie Bly and then proceeded to dismantle the limitations that 19th century society tried to place on her.
She tore them down.
Yeah, she did. We'll be breaking down her undercover infiltration of a notorious medical institution and the logistical realities of her record-breaking global race.
Oh, the race is so good.
It is. And also her highly complex, often overlooked later years as an industrialist and war correspondent. This deep dive is an analysis of the deeper systemic scandals she exposed.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, why the historical record has a persistent habit of just, erasing the pioneering women who build the very frameworks we still use today.
I want to set the tone for you, the listener, right away. Because this isn't some tragic story of Victorian suffering.
Not at all.
It's a fiery retort to every single time society tells a specific demographic, you can't. But to understand how a 20-year-old even have the nerve to write that kind of letter in the first place, we have to look at how Elizabeth Cochran was forged.
We do.
She's born in Pennsylvania in 1864, and her early life is basically defined by a complete lack of a safety net.
Yeah, the defining moment really happens when she is just 6 years old.
Right.
Her father, who was, a moderately successful mill owner and judge, passes away. Crucially, he dies without a will.
Let's pause on that, because I feel like today, dying intestate is a headache for a family.
Sure.
But in the 1860s, it's an existential crisis.
Yeah,
right?
it's catastrophic.
Okay.
Absolutely catastrophic. Without a will, the legal protections for his widow and his children by his second marriage, which included Elizabeth, essentially evaporated.
Wow.
Under the property laws of the time, the estate was divided in a way that left her mother without the means to maintain their standard of living.
So they just lose everything.
Basically, they were plunged from middle-class comfort into immediate grinding poverty. The family lost the home they had relied upon, and the cascading effect of that financial ruin is just profound.
Right.
Her mother, desperate for economic security, eventually entered into a second marriage. But that marriage turned out to be physically and emotionally abusive.
And from the sources, her mother actually did something incredibly stigmatized for the 1870s, didn't she?
She did?
She escaped that marriage through a formal divorce.
Yeah, and the legal threshold for divorce back then was remarkably high.
I can imagine.
You had to publicly prove severe cruelty or abandonment in open court, which meant airing the family's darkest traumas to the entire community.
Oh, wow.
It resulted in massive social ostracization.
So just think about what Elizabeth is observing during her formative years.
Right.
She is watching the women in her life navigate a deeply hostile world. She feels the sudden sting of poverty. She sees that marriage does not guarantee safety, and she learns that the legal and social systems in place offer literally zero grace to a woman without means.
None.
She knows she has to make her own way.
Which perfectly contextualizes her reaction to that 1885 editorial.
Exactly.
When she reads, "What are girls good for?" she isn't reading a theoretical debate. She's reading an attack on her own survival.
Yes.
The editorial argued women should rely on men, but her lived experience proved that relying on men could lead directly to destitution or abuse.
So she writes this letter to the editor, and she signs it, Lonely Orphan Girl.
Right.
And the sources suggest the letter was so sharp, so furious, and so brilliantly articulated that the editor of the Dispatch, this man named George Madden, actually runs an advertisement asking the anonymous author to step forward.
He recognized raw talent. It's important to understand the newspaper industry of the 1880s was fiercely competitive.
Right, they needed fresh voices.
Exactly, engaging voices. When Elizabeth walked into the office, Madden was shocked she was a young woman. He had totally assumed the forceful tone belonged to a man.
Of course he did.
But he offered her an opportunity to write a piece for the paper anyway.
But they hit a logistical roadblock, like, immediately.
Yeah.
Because if she's going to write for the paper, she can't use her real name.
No, absolutely not.
It was considered completely improper for a respectable woman's name to appear in print unless it was for her birth, her marriage, or her death.
Right. A woman writing under her given name, especially about serious topics, wouldn't be taken seriously. Plus, it would scandalize her family.
Oh, for sure.
So the editorial staff had to invent a persona. They lifted a name from a popular Stephen Foster song of the era, Nellie Bly, but the paper accidentally misspelled it with an IE instead of a Y.
That's amazing.
Yeah, the first piece was published under Nellie Bly, and the byline just stuck. It became her professional shield.
Okay, so she has the job, she has the shield.
Yeah.
But she's still operating in 1885.
Right.
She immediately hits the invisible wall of the newspaper industry. Because when a woman was hired at a paper back then, she wasn't assigned to City Hall or the police beat.
No, she was relegated to what was called the women's pages.
Right. And what exactly were the women's pages?
They were basically a gilded cage. They were designed to attract female readers and advertisers, focusing strictly on fashion, high society gossip, gardening tips, and, light domestic advice.
So fluff.
Exactly. It was highly profitable for the papers, but completely journalistically hollow.
And Nellie Bly completely rejects this assignment. She starts pitching and reporting on things that actually matter to the working class women she sees every day.
Yeah, she investigates the conditions of female factory workers.
Right.
She writes about the inequities of divorce law, obviously drawing directly from her mother's harrowing experience.
And then she somehow manages to convince her editors to let her go to Mexico as a foreign correspondent.
Which is wild.
She spends 6 months there. How does a single woman in her early 20s even manage that logistically in the 1880s?
Well, she traveled with her mother as a chaperone, which satisfied the Victorian propriety of the time. But her reporting was anything but proper.
Yeah, she wasn't writing about the nice scenery.
No. She didn't write travelogues. She embedded herself in the culture and began investigating the political realities of Mexico under the regime of Porfirio Diaz.
And Diaz was essentially a dictator at that point, right? He was heavily restricting the press.
Precisely. Diaz was modernizing Mexico's infrastructure, but doing so through severe political repression.
Right.
Bly began dispatching articles back to Pittsburgh, criticizing the government's treatment of the poor and the imprisonment of local journalists.
Wow.
She was actively undermining a foreign head of state in print.
Which escalated to the point where she literally had to flee the country.
She did.
The Mexican government caught wind of her reporting, and she received actual threats of arrest. She had to pack her bags, take a train to Veracruz, and get on a ship back to the U.S. just to avoid being thrown into a Mexican prison.
The pattern emerging here is just crucial. She wasn't just pushing professional boundaries. She was discovering that journalism could be a tangible weapon against injustice.
Right.
But she also learned that using that weapon meant placing herself in physical jeopardy.
You would think that kind of reporting would make her the most sought-after journalist in the country.
You would think so.
But when she moves to New York City in 1887 to hit the big leagues, she faces a massive brick wall. She spends months facing constant rejection simply because no major paper in the city wanted a woman for hard news.
Right. They all told her to go back to the women's pages.
She was nearly completely out of money, living in a cheap boarding house, and came dangerously close to failing out of the industry entirely.
Yeah, it was a really low point.
But she decides to make one last desperate play. She storms the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's New York World.
And to understand what happens next, we really have to define the ecosystem of the New York world.
Right, let's talk about Pulitzer.
Pulitzer was pioneering a style that would later be called yellow journalism, or muckraking.
Okay.
It relied heavily on sensationalism, massive headlines, and investigative crusades designed to expose corruption and, frankly, boost circulation.
It was very loud.
Extremely loud, it was aggressive and constantly looking for the next big spectacle.
Wait, I want to clarify something here. When Nellie Bly finally gets in front of Pulitzer's managing editor, John Cockrell, they don't just hand her an assignment on the city desk.
No, they don't.
They hand her this seemingly impossible, terrifying dare. Get inside the notorious women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island. And not as a reporter taking a guided tour, but committed as an actual inmate.
Yeah.
Was Pulitzer actually trying to empower a female journalist here? Or was he just sending a desperate, broke young woman on a highly dangerous suicide mission because it would sell papers? Because that sounds highly exploitative.
It's an excellent question, and historically it's likely a mix of both.
Okay.
Pulitzer's papers thrived on exposing urban decay, and there were rumors of horrific abuses at Blackwell's Island. But the institution was impenetrable.
Because they could hide things.
Right. The authorities knew how to hide the reality from visiting committees. The editors knew that an insider's account would be a blockbuster story.
So they wanted the scoop.
Exactly. Did they care about the plight of the mentally ill? Yes. Did they care about the safety of a freelance female reporter they barely knew? Probably less so.
Yeah.
They saw a willing volunteer who needed a job, and they totally leveraged her desperation.
That context makes her choice even heavier. The level of commitment this dare requires is just terrifying.
It really is.
We're talking about a time way before hidden cameras or wiretaps. She had to become the story. The sources detail how she went back to her boarding house and taught herself how to look, quote-unquote, insane.
She practiced in a mirror.
Exactly. And I want to focus on the how here. What were the actual medical criteria for insanity in 1887 that she was trying to mimic?
Well, the diagnostic criteria of the 19th century were deeply flawed, highly subjective, and intensely gendered.
How so?
Psychiatry back then was largely based on observing deviance from societal norms.
Okay.
For a woman, insanity could be diagnosed based on symptoms like hysteria, quote-unquote nervous exhaustion, a wandering eye, or simply refusing to conform to expected submissive behaviors.
So basically just being difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Bly knew she didn't need to act violently. She just needed to act disconnected from reality.
So she checks into a temporary home for working women under the name Nellie Brown.
Right.
She starts staring blankly at the walls, refusing to sleep, claiming she has amnesia, and telling the other boarders that everyone looks crazy to her.
It works perfectly.
It does. The police are called, and she is taken before a judge.
And the judicial and medical mechanisms that process her are staggeringly inept. She's examined by several doctors.
Right.
She maintains her story of having a severe headache and lost memories. The doctors, looking at a young woman who is unchaperoned, slightly disheveled, and claiming amnesia, don't look for physical causes.
They just jump to conclusions.
They declare her hopelessly insane. One doctor famously diagnosed her with dementia, simply based on a brief conversation and her wandering expression.
Just a wandering expression.
Yep.
And this is where we have to push back on the historical tendency to call this a journalistic stunt.
I agree completely.
Calling it a stunt implies a safety net. It implies it was a trick. Once a judge signed that commitment order and those heavy doors locked behind her on Blackwell's Island, she was legally a ward of the state.
Yes.
She had no ironclad guarantee that Pulitzer's editor would actually send a lawyer to rescue her. If the paper decided to back out, or if they just forgot, she was trapped in a place designed to swallow women whole.
It was an incredible assumption of risk. She birthed the modern immersive expose right there.
She really did.
She proved that to report the truth of a closed system, you cannot rely on the official statements of the people running it. You have to subject your own physical body to the machinery of that system.
And the conditions inside that machinery were brutal. Let's look at the specifics she recorded in her subsequent book, 10 Days in a Madhouse.
The physical environment was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, the pavilions were freezing cold. The food was spoiled. She described being served rancid butter and bread that was barely edible, and the drinking water was completely unsanitary.
Well, the treatments.
Oh, the treatments.
The treatments were where the real horror lay. These weren't medical interventions. They were entirely punitive.
Right.
She detailed ice water baths where women were stripped, scrubbed roughly, and had buckets of freezing water poured over their heads until they were gasping, turning blue, and shaking violently. It was essentially a form of waterboarding.
My God. She reported that the nurses were profoundly abusive, often physically beating the patients and choking them. She saw women roped together like livestock when they were taken out for their brief periods of fresh air.
Yeah, it was just a warehouse for human suffering, completely devoid of any actual therapeutic or medical care.
But as horrific as those physical conditions were, the deeper, more insidious systemic scandal that Bly exposed was what happened with her own diagnosis when she was inside.
This is the truly terrifying part.
Right, this is the part of the story that requires us to really examine the mechanics of institutions. Because once she was on the island, Nellie Bly dropped the act.
She completely stopped pretending.
She stopped claiming to have amnesia. She started behaving exactly as herself. She spoke calmly, she was completely rational, she asked logical questions, and the terrifying discovery she made was that the doctors and nurses completely ignored her sanity.
It made absolutely no difference whatsoever.
None.
I like to think of the asylum diagnosis functioning like a Chinese finger trap.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
The harder you fought to prove your sanity, the tighter the diagnosis gripped you. When Bly explicitly and calmly told the doctors, "I am well, my memory has returned, I should not be here," the medical staff documented those rational protests as clinical proof of her illness.
Unbelievable.
They viewed her calmness as a symptom of deceit, typical of the quote-unquote cunning insane.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the logic here.
Okay.
If you are terrified and crying because you've been locked up, you're displaying hysteria, therefore you are insane.
Right.
If you are perfectly calm and articulate a legal argument for your release, you are displaying unnatural cunning, therefore you are insane. You literally cannot win. Your rationality is weaponized against you.
Sanity itself was reframed as a symptom. The system possessed this terrible circular logic.
It's a trap.
It is. Once an authority figure applied the label of mad to a woman, no action, word, or behavior by the victim could ever unlabel them. The institution wasn't designed to cure anyone. It was designed to contain them.
And this tragedy compounded when Bly started interviewing the other inmates, because she quickly realized she wasn't the only perfectly sane woman trapped in this finger trap.
No, she discovered the asylum was functioning as a disposal mechanism for the powerless.
Right.
Many of the women inside were not mentally ill. They were committed for other crimes in the eyes of 1880s society. Some were simply desperately poor, and the city didn't know what else to do with them.
Others were recent immigrants who didn't speak English. Think about how terrifying that is for you.
Yeah.
You arrive in New York, you get separated from your family, you don't speak the language, you naturally get distressed. The police pick you up, take you to an English-speaking doctor, and because you can't communicate your circumstances, you are diagnosed as incomprehensible and sent to an asylum.
And perhaps most chillingly, she met women who had simply become inconvenient.
Right, the inconvenient women.
Exactly. A husband who wanted to pursue a new relationship but couldn't get a divorce could easily bribe a physician to declare his current wife insane.
That is sickening.
Families who didn't want to financially support an aging or unruly aunt could have her committed. The medical system provided this sanitized legal way to just disappear people.
Bly spent 10 days in that nightmare. 10 days of watching sane women slowly lose their actual minds because of the isolation and abuse. Finally, the New York world keeps its promise.
Thankfully.
They send an attorney who argues her case, reveals her true identity, and secures her release. And the moment she steps off that island, she unleashes absolute hell on the system.
She publishes a 2-part series, and the articles, with sensational headlines like "Behind Asylum Bars" and "Inside the Madhouse," were explosive.
People must have been shocked.
The public was completely captivated. This wasn't some dry government report. It was a first-person thriller written by an attractive young woman who had survived a literal house of horrors.
Right, and the stories were eventually compiled into the book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, in 1887.
But the impact wasn't just higher newspaper sales. Her reporting forced the hand of the government.
Yes.
The public outcry was so immense that a grand jury was convened to investigate the Department of Public Charities and Correction, which oversaw Blackwell's Island. And they actually asked Nellie Bly to assist them.
She literally accompanied the grand jurors back to the asylum.
She did.
Of course, the administration had tried to clean the place up before the jury arrived, but Bly knew exactly where to look. She pointed out the systemic abuses and the specific staff responsible.
And real, tangible reforms followed. Because of her undercover work, the city appropriated an additional $1 million, which is a staggering sum in 1887, specifically for the care of the insane.
Yeah.
Abusive nurses were dismissed. They improved the sanitation and the food, and crucially, they instituted a policy of employing translators of foreign-born patients, closing the loophole that allowed immigrants to be committed just for not speaking English.
That is just incredible. This was the birth of immersive investigative
It
journalism.
really was.
She fundamentally changed the role of the newspaper. It was no longer just a passive observer recording what politicians said or summarizing police blotters. It became an active participant in society, an advocate that could punch through the walls of corrupt institutions.
Right.
If you've ever watched a documentary where someone goes undercover to expose a factory farm or read an expose about conditions inside a private prison, you are looking at the direct descendants of what Nellie Bly engineered. So, she is now the most famous journalist in America. She's changed the law, she's survived a nightmare. Most people would take a desk job and coast on that reputation for a decade.
Yeah, you'd think she'd take a break.
But instead, she decides to race around the entire planet.
It is a phenomenal pivot.
It's wild.
In 1888, she approaches her editors at The World with an incredibly audacious proposal. She wants to turn fiction into reality. Jules Verne had published his massively successful novel Around the World in 80 Days, featuring the fictional character Phileas Fogg.
What?
Bly tells her editors, I want to beat Fogg's record, and I want to do it for real.
It's the 19th century equivalent of an extreme logistical challenge. She's proposing to circumnavigate the globe using existing commercial steamships and rail lines, dealing with real-world weather, coal shortages, and telegraph delays.
Right.
But the editors at the New York World respond with the most infuriating, atypical objections imaginable. What do they actually tell her?
Their resistance highlights the exact prejudices she had been fighting her whole life. John Cockerell told her frankly that it was impossible for a woman.
Of course he did.
He argued that she would need a male chaperone to protect her in foreign ports. He insisted she wouldn't be able to handle the physical toll. But the most absurd objection was logistical.
Oh, this part is crazy.
He claimed a woman would require too many trunks of luggage for her various dresses and hats, and managing that luggage would inevitably cause her to miss vital train and ship connections.
Unbelievable.
The editors concluded that if the paper was going to sponsor this spectacle, it would be better to send a man.
I love her response to this because it shows she understood exactly how to manipulate the media landscape.
She was brilliant at it.
She doesn't just argue with them. She threatens their bottom line. She reportedly looks at her editor and says, very well, start the man, and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him.
She basically told them, try me. She knew her value. She forced their hand by threatening to take the spectacle and the massive circulation boost it would bring to their competitors. The World finally caved and agreed to fund the expedition.
So on November 14th, 1889, Nellie Bly boards the Augusta Victoria steamer in Hoboken, New Jersey. And remember the editor's argument about her needing too much luggage.
Right.
Let's talk about the logistics of her packing because it's brilliant. She traveled with exactly one single bag.
One bag.
A small leather gripsack, 16 inches wide.
She applied intense practical engineering to her wardrobe.
Yep.
Inside that single bag, she packed 2 traveling caps, 3 veils, a pair of slippers, a set of toiletries, some writing materials, and a few changes of underwear.
That's it.
For her outerwear, she wore one sturdy, custom-made dark blue broadcloth dress and a plaid ghillie coat. That was literally it. She wore the exact same outfit essentially the entire way around the globe. She eliminated the luggage problem entirely.
And as for financing, she carried a small bank book, but mostly she carried a pouch of British gold sovereigns around her neck, because the British Empire was so vast that their currency was accepted at almost every port.
The logistics she was navigating alone are staggering.
Furiously.
This is an era before commercial flight, before seamless global communication. She had to rely on the schedules of the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, traversing the Suez Canal, navigate the Indian Ocean during unpredictable weather, and cross the Pacific.
Right.
If she missed a connection by an hour, she might have to wait 2 solid weeks for the next ship.
And the public frenzy back in the United States goes absolute nuclear. The New York World turns this into a masterclass in interactive media.
They really milked it.
Oh, yeah. They start running a guessing contest where readers can try to predict her exact arrival time down to the second. The prize was a free trip to Europe.
Wow.
The sources note there were nearly 1 million entries. People are buying the paper every single day just to track her progress on printed maps.
It became a cultural phenomenon. There were Nellie Bly board games, Nellie Bly trading cards.
It's amazing.
But the pressure mounted significantly because a rival publication, the Cosmopolitan, decided to capitalize on the frenzy.
Oh, right. The rival.
On the very day Bly left, they dispatched their own reporter, a woman named Elizabeth Bisland, to race Bly by traveling the opposite direction around the globe heading west, while Bly headed east.
Suddenly, it's not just a race against the fictional man. It's a very real high-stakes race between two female journalists.
Exactly.
And in the middle of this intense, time-sensitive race, Bly makes a decision that I find just fascinating. While she's in Europe, she deliberately slows herself down to take a 2-day detour through France for one specific reason.
She wants to meet Jules Verne.
Yes.
She actually traveled to Amiens to meet him and his wife. It's deeply humanizing detail. It shows she wasn't just a cold machine focused on the finish line. She understood the romance and the narrative power of the journey. Verne was initially skeptical that a young woman could accomplish this, but after meeting her, he became one of her biggest supporters. He was actively tracking her progress.
So she travels through the Suez Canal to Colombo, to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Yokohama. She faces massive delays monsoons in the Pacific, waiting days for ships to coal. Finally, she crosses the Pacific and lands in San Francisco.
And she's on the home stretch.
From there, the New York World actually charters a special single-car train called the Miss Nellie Bly Special to rocket her across the American continent.
And on January 25, 1890, she arrives back in New Jersey, the final time. 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds.
She completely obliterated the fictional record.
She did, and crucially, she beat Elizabeth Bisland, who had been delayed by a slow ship crossing the Atlantic.
The cultural shift this caused cannot be overstated. She was greeted by massive crowds, brass bands, and cannon fire echoing across the harbor.
Cannon.
Right. Nellie Bly instantly became synonymous with the idea that a woman could do absolutely anything a man could do, conquer global geography, and do it faster.
But this is where most historical summaries of her stop. We tend to freeze our historical figures in the moment of their greatest triumph.
We do.
But the story of Elizabeth Cochrane, the woman behind the Nellie Bly persona, doesn't end with that race. She lived a vast, highly complex life well beyond the headlines.
We really need to dedicate time to this next phase, because she essentially lived a second and third act that most people could never manage.
Right.
A few years after the race, she surprises everyone by effectively retiring from journalism. In 1895, she marries a man named Robert Seaman. He is a very wealthy industrialist, and notably, he's about 40 years older than her.
Which caused its own minor scandal, obviously, but the marriage transitioned her from a working-class reporter into high society.
Right.
However, she didn't settle into the passive role of a wealthy socialite. When Seaman's health began to fail shortly after their marriage, Nellie didn't just passively inherit his wealth. She actively took over the daily operations of his massive manufacturing company.
The Ironclad Manufacturing Company in Brooklyn.
Exactly.
And this wasn't a small boutique business. Ironclad was a major producer of enameled ironware, boilers, and milk cans. She became one of the leading female industrialists in the United States, managing hundreds of employees. But she didn't just manage the ledgers, she actually involved herself in the engineering.
Yes, she held several patents in her own name.
Really?
Yeah. The most significant was her redesign of the milk can. She patented a seamless steel milk can that was far more durable and sanitary than previous designs. She also held a patent for a novel stacking garbage can.
Oh.
And she is widely credited with helping to invent the 55-gallon steel barrel, which became the standard container for the burgeoning oil industry.
Wow.
She was literally reshaping American manufacturing logistics.
And as an employer, she brought her journalistic ethics to the factory floor. Remembering the grueling conditions she reported on as a young woman, she instituted major reforms for her workers.
She did.
She built libraries, fitness centers, and health clinics for her employees. She paid them fair wages.
But it's vital we keep her human in our analysis. She wasn't an infallible superhero.
Right.
Her tenure as an industrialist ultimately ended in catastrophe. While she was focused on employee welfare and product design, she severely neglected the accounting department.
Oh, no. What exactly happened there? Was it just poor business management?
It was a massive embezzlement scheme.
Oh, wow.
Her factory managers and accountants had been systematically forging checks and cooking the books for years. By the time she uncovered the fraud, millions of dollars were missing and the company was crippled by debt.
That's devastating.
It really was. The ensuing legal battles drained her personal fortune. Despite her desperate attempts to save it, the company went bankrupt and she lost the business entirely.
Which is awful, but it makes her story so much more tangible. She took an immense risk entering a male-dominated industry. She achieved incredible innovation, but she also experienced massive, crushing failure.
Yeah.
But does she let that bankruptcy destroy her? No. She reinvents herself again.
She returns to the profession that made her, and she doesn't start small.
No, she doesn't.
In 1914, World War I breaks out. Bly, who was in Europe dealing with the fallout of her business litigation, heads straight to the Eastern Front.
Just heads right in.
She becomes one of the very first female war correspondents.
Think about that. She's 50 years old, standing in active war zones, reporting from the trenches in Austria and Serbia. She's sending dispatches back home detailing the brutal realities of mechanized warfare and the devastating human cost on the civilian populations.
And when she finally returns to America, she throws herself into covering the women's suffrage movement.
Coming full circle.
Exactly. She uses her platform to advocate for the exact rights she had been proving women deserved since she wrote that angry letter in Pittsburgh 30 years prior. Yeah.
She accurately predicted that it would take an amendment to secure the vote. She continued reporting, working on behalf of orphans and widows, right up until she died of pneumonia in 1922.
Her life is a monument to relentless action. But this brings us to the great paradox of her memory, and really the core thesis we want to explore at the end of this deep dive.
Right.
Despite inventing the undercover expose, despite setting a global record, despite her patents and her war correspondence, she somehow slipped out of the mainstream historical narrative for decades.
It's a textbook example of institutional erasure.
Yeah.
The method she created, investigative, immersive muckraking, thrived. It changed the world.
Totally.
But the memory of the woman who built it was overshadowed. The men who followed her into the genre a decade later, writers like Upton Sinclair with The Jungle or Lincoln Steffens, those are the names that high school history textbooks canonized.
Why did that happen? How do you misplace the most famous woman in the world?
It happens through the application of reductive labels.
The male-dominated historical establishment retrospectively labeled her a stunt girl.
Ah, there's that word again.
Right. By categorizing her asylum investigation and her global race as mere stunts, implying they were frivolous novelties rather than rigorous journalism, they successfully minimized her impact. Society found it easier to digest the idea of a male crusader exposing corruption than a female disruptor who challenged the very fabric of male authority.
And if we bring this full circle, there is a striking, deeply tragic parallel to the lessons she tried to teach us about Blackwell's Island.
There is.
Remember the deeper scandal of the asylum? It was about how easily the powerless could be disappeared by a label. Once the medical establishment applied the label of mad to those women, their humanity was erased and they were vanished from society.
That is exactly the mechanism of erasure. Just as society kept having to relearn the lessons of the asylum, that institutions can easily warehouse the vulnerable if we aren't constantly vigilant, the historical establishment applied the label of stunt reporter to Bly.
They labeled her away.
By applying that label, they successfully disappeared her immense intellectual and systemic contributions. We kept the reforms, we kept the investigative techniques, but we forgot the pioneer.
So we have journeyed from a fatherless girl in Pennsylvania who refused to be told she was a monstrosity for having ambition, to an undercover inmate who exposed the darkest flaws of 19th century psychiatry, to an industrialist and a war correspondent.
Quite a journey.
It really is. The original question posed in that 1885 newspaper was never really what girls were good for. The real question is why it took the world so long to listen to the answer that Nellie Bly spent her entire life shouting.
And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. One that connects her era directly to the reality you are navigating today.
Okay.
Think about the digital age we live in right now. In Bly's time, it was the physical walls of an asylum and the ink of a medical chart that trapped people in boxes they couldn't escape. Today, what modern labels do we apply? Through opaque algorithms, rigid societal echo chambers, or permanent digital footprints that trap people just as permanently as those asylum walls did? If Nellie Bly were here today armed with her brilliant, defiant audacity, What invisible accepted system do you think she would infiltrate next?
That is a fascinating question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the labels, and we'll see you next time.